The almost imperceptible dry whisper, a sound like ancient parchment crumbling in a forgotten crypt, was the first warning, a susurrus so faint it barely registered against the gentle rhythmic hum of the specialized air purifier in Lily's bedroom. Marcus Thorne, senior field biologist and special investigator for the State Department of Fish and Wildlife, a man whose ears were tuned to the subtle languages of the wild, paused in the doorway, every nerve ending honed by years of tracking elusive creatures in remote, often hostile environments, suddenly inexplicably on high alert. It was nearing 9 on a still oppressive summer night, the air thick and cloying with the scent of honeysuckle from the rampant vine that climbed the trellis just outside Lily's west-facing window, a vine Patricia Dunsmore had repeatedly vehemently demanded they remove. His daughter Lily, all of 10 years old, a wisp of a girl with eyes that held the ancient wisdom of stars, lay propped against a carefully arranged mountain of hypoallergenic pillows in her custom-made adjustable bed, her face usually so expressive, now pale, but strangely serene as she listened to an audiobook through soft, child-sized headphones. Her beloved calico cat, Pip, a rescue with an uncanny sensitivity to Lily's moods, was a furry, purring, tricolored lump curled in the traditional cat loaf position at the foot of her bed, a small warm anchor in her often turbulent sea of physical discomfort. Lily lived with a severe hypermobile form of Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, a cruel, invisible genetic disorder that made her connective tissues fragile as spun glass, her joints agonizingly unstable, her skin prone to tearing at the slightest provocation. Some days she could manage short distances with her brightly decorated carbon fiber crutches, her movements a study in determined grace. Others, like today, after a particularly painful series of joint subluxations in her hips and shoulders, confined her to her bed or her lightweight, custom-fitted pediatric wheelchair. Despite the chronic debilitating pain and the myriad physical limitations that were her constant unwelcome companions, Lily possessed a fiercely keen intellect, an artist's observant eye for the minute details of the world, and a spirit that stubbornly refused to be tethered by her recalcitrant body. Her room was her carefully curated sanctuary, a testament to her passions, walls adorned with her remarkably detailed drawings of local birds and insects, shelves neatly lined with her collection of pressed flowers and leaves, and stacks of books on every imaginable subject from astrophysics to ancient Egyptian mythology. "Everything okay in here, my little bug?" Mark asked, his voice intentionally softer than the almost subliminal whisper that had disturbed him, a sound that felt alien in this meticulously ordered, medically necessary space. Lily, startled, pulled off her headphones, her bright, intelligent hazel eyes, so like her mother's, meeting his. A small frown creased her forehead. "Just Pip dreaming daddy," she said, her voice a little thready from the day's fatigue and the powerful analgesics she required. "He's chasing giant dream mice again, I think. He keeps twitching his whiskers." Mark smiled a genuine warm smile that always seemed to ease some of the tension lines around Lily's eyes, but the profound unease, the primal alarm bell, clanging in the deep recesses of his biologist's brain, didn't dissipate. The sound hadn't been Pip's soft, sleepy twitches, nor the rustle of his fur as he resettled. This was different, more deliberate, more insidious. He let his gaze travel slowly, methodically around the room, a room designed to be Lily's haven, her pain-free zone filled with her drawings, her collections, her quiet joys. His eyes snagged on the large picture window, or rather on the almost invisible hair-thin gap where the custom-fitted ultra-fine mesh insect screen met the polished wood of the sill. Had he checked that specific latch this morning after Chloe had aired out the room, he usually did a habit born of both his profession and his paternal vigilance. Willow Glen Heights bordered a substantial greenbelt, and while he encouraged biodiversity, Lily's compromised immune system meant they had to be extra cautious about anything entering her controlled environment. Then he saw it, and his blood, which had merely chilled with a vague premonition, now seemed to turn to ice water in his veins. A tiny, dark, almost perfectly spherical shape, no bigger than his thumbnail, clung with an unnatural stillness to the painted underside of the window ledge just inside the room. Another slightly larger a little further along, and then another and another. Black widows, Latrodectus hesperus. Their glossy, obsidian-black bodies were unmistakable, as was the notorious, visceral crimson hourglass, marking clearly visible on the ventral side of one particularly bold female that had ventured further onto the sill. He didn't need to see that telltale marking on all of them. He knew their morphology, their characteristic leg-to-body ratio, their slightly hesitant, skittering movement when disturbed. And there weren't just one or two, a random, unfortunate intrusion from the garden. As his eyes, highly adapted to spotting camouflaged creatures, adjusted to the soft, filtered room light, he saw more, a horrifying, silent constellation of them, emerging with nightmare slowness from that tiny, almost imperceptible gap in the window screen, some already making their deliberate leggy way down the wall towards the overflowing bookshelf nearest the window, others more alarmingly heading with sinister purpose towards the head of Lily's bed, a veritable swarm. This wasn't a casual, accidental intrusion of one or two spiders seeking shelter. This was an invasion, a targeted infiltration. Lily, sweetheart. Mark said, his voice a low, urgent, preternaturally calm current that he prayed masked the sudden, sickening lurch in his stomach, the adrenaline dump that made his extremities tingle. I need you to do something very important for me, very, very slowly. Can you reach your emergency call button on your bedside console without moving your body too much, especially your legs? Lily's intelligent eyes, always so attuned to the slightest nuance in his voice, an expression widened, sensing the profound shift in his demeanor, the coiled, dangerous tension in his stance. She nodded, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement of her head, her small pale hand, its joints already showing the characteristic hypermobility of her condition, moving with painful, excruciating slowness towards the large, easily accessible call button on her bedside console, a button that connected directly to his and his wife Chloe's phones, and also to a central monitoring service for medical emergencies. Good girl. That's my brave girl. Now, when I say so, I want you to press it hard, and then I'm going to lift you very, very carefully, straight up out of that bed. Don't make any sudden movements, okay? Not a wiggle. Just stay as absolutely still as you can for me. Can you do that? He could see at least a dozen of the venomous arachnids now, a silent, creeping tide of polished black, eight-legged death, their movements unhurried, confident as if they owned the room. Pip, sensing the profound change in the atmosphere, or perhaps the subtle scent of the spiders themselves, or even Lily's sudden terrified stillness, lifted his head from his paws, emitting a low guttural growl, his ears swiveling, his body tensing. Okay, Lilybug, Mark commanded softly, his focus absolute. Press it now. As Lily's trembling finger made contact with the button, Mark was already moving his actions, precise, economical, born of long, hard experience, handling dangerous and unpredictable wildlife in high-stress situations. He scooped Lily surprisingly light, despite her 10 years, due to her slender frame, into his arms in one swift fluid motion, her body rigid with a fear she was trying, with all her might, to control her breath, catching in a tiny silent sob. He backed away from the bed, his eyes never leaving the advancing spiders scanning the floor, the walls tracking the movement of every single arachnid, his biologist's brain cataloging numbers, assessing vectors, noting species-specific behaviors, while his father's heart hammered a frantic, desperate rhythm against his ribs, a primal scream of terror and rage trapped in his chest. Chloe. He yelled, his voice tight, with an urgency that brooked no delay, as he carried Lily out of the contaminated room. Code red emergency in Lily's bedroom. We have a massive Black Widow infestation. Looks like a deliberate targeted introduction. Get the emergency biocontainment kit from the lab truck in the driveway now. Call 911, request immediate police backup and a full county hazmat evaluation. Tell them senior biologist Thorne declares a potential aggravated assault with a Class 2 biological agent. Secure the entire west wing of the house. Make absolutely sure Pip stays out of there. His wife, Chloe, a horticultural therapist, whose calm demeanor and quiet strength were the bedrock of their often challenging family life, met him in the hallway, her face usually so serene, instantly paling to a chalky white at his words, but her actions immediate and decisive. She took Lily from him without a word, her expression a terrifying mixture of raw fear and fierce maternal protection, and headed swiftly towards the safety of the brightly lit living room at the opposite end of the house, already on her mobile phone, her voice tight but astonishingly steady as she relayed the critical information to the emergency dispatcher. Mark, meanwhile, didn't hesitate. He sprinted to his state-issued Fish and Wildlife field truck, a rugged vehicle equipped for almost any contingency, parked in their driveway, yanking open the secured rear compartment and grabbing his heavy-duty biocontainment gear, thick, puncture-resistant Kevlar-lined gloves that reached his elbows, specialized ventilated collection jars with locking lids, long-handled feather-light entomological forceps, a high-intensity headlamp with switchable UV capabilities that would make the spiders fluoresce a ghostly green, rendering them instantly visible even in the darkest, most inaccessible corners they favored. This wasn't just a random, unlucky infestation. The sheer number, the specific location, the subtle but undeniable evidence of facilitated entry. This was a calculated act of unimaginable cruelty, a biological weapon deployed with chilling precision against his fragile, medically vulnerable innocent daughter. And he had a sickening, visceral certainty, a cold knot of fury, coalescing in his gut about who was responsible. Patricia Dunsmore. It had to be. The setup for this night of unimaginable horror, this violation of their most sacred safe space, had been a slow, insidious campaign of escalating aggression, a meticulously orchestrated psychological war waged by one, Patricia Dunsmore, the formidable and fanatically zealous HOA president of their otherwise placid, picture-perfect suburban neighborhood, Willow Glen Heights. Dunsmore, a woman in her late 60s with a ramrod posture, a sharply ascetic face, and eyes that burned with a disturbing, almost messianic righteous fervor, was obsessed with her own twisted dogmatic vision of natural order and ecological purity. She viewed any deviation from her narrow, self-defined parameters of a native California ecosystem not just as an eyesore, but as a personal affront, a moral failing, a blight to be ruthlessly eradicated. And lately, her intense focus, her particular brand of sanctimonious ecological zealotry, had turned with unnerving, predatory intensity towards Mark's family, and specifically with a chilling specificity towards Lily and everything associated with her complex medical needs. Dunsmore had made no secret of her profound disdain for anything she considered unnatural, artificial, or dependent. Lily's specialized medical equipment, the quiet hum of her oxygen concentrator on bad days, her occasional need for home nursing care, even the small, meticulously maintained raised bed sensory garden that Chloe, with her horticultural therapy expertise, had designed and built for Lily beside their patio. A vibrant, accessible garden filled with soft, textured, easy-to-reach plants and gentle, fragrant herbs, some of which were indeed carefully selected non-native species chosen specifically for their proven therapeutic properties, their calming scents, their tactile appeal for a child with sensory processing sensitivities, had all become targets for Dunsmore's relentless, poisonous ire. She'd made increasingly pointed, cruel, snide comments at sparsely attended HOA meetings about artificial environments that disrupt the natural balance, about the inappropriateness of coddling weakness, her words dripping with a sanctimonious contempt that made Mark's blood boil and Chloe's hands clench in silent fury. She spoke of a return to purity, a restoration of nature's intended design, her pronouncements taking on an almost cult-like fervor. The inciting incident, the flashpoint that had ignited the smoldering conflict into open, declared warfare, had occurred approximately a month earlier at a contentious, poorly publicized emergency HOA meeting Dunsmore had called with little notice. Dunsmore, having successfully pushed through a bewildering series of increasingly draconian and vaguely worded HOA bylaws regarding mandatory native landscaping compliance and the systematic elimination of invasive floral and faunal species, a category that in her warped mind seemed to conveniently include anything she personally disliked or deemed aesthetically offensive, had issued a formal, legally intimidating, non-negotiable order to comply to the Thorns, dismantle Lily's entire sensory garden within 14 days, or face escalating daily financial penalties, the eventual forced removal of the garden by HOA contracted landscapers at the Thorns' expense, and ultimately a lien against their property. Your daughter's so-called therapeutic horticultural arrangements are a flagrant violation of established community standards and a direct affront to the delicate, intrinsic ecological balance we are striving with such diligence to restore in Willow Glen. Dunsmore had stated, her voice quivering with a disturbing self-righteous conviction, her gaze sweeping disdainfully over Mark and Chloe. Nature, Mr. and Mrs. Thorn has its own immutable ways of dealing with the frail, the compromised, and the ill-suited. We, as responsible stewards of this land, must not interfere with its profound inherent wisdom. Her chilling pronouncement equating Lily's small, cherished therapeutic garden with a noxious weed to be purged, a disease to be eradicated, had been met with a stunned, uncomfortable silence by most of the few residents present, and a furious, though carefully controlled rebuttal from Mark and Chloe, who had pointed out the discriminatory nature of her demands and the specific therapeutic benefits of Lily's garden. But Dunsmore backed by a small vocal clique of equally fanatical followers on the HOA board, residents who seemed to hang on her. Every word had been unmoved, her expression one of serene, implacable certainty. The battle lines already faintly drawn had been etched that day in stone deep and irrevocable. Now, as Mark, clad in his protective gear, methodically began the terrifying, meticulous task of locating and safely containing every single Black Widow spider in Lily's violated sanctuary, he knew with a certainty that settled like a shard of ice in his soul that this was Patricia Dunsmore's idea of restoring natural purity. This was her nature's wisdom, delivered in its most venomous, insidious, and personal form. This wasn't just an act of grotesque intimidation, a warning shot across their bows. This was a direct, calculated attempt on his daughter's life, cloaked in the perverse, sanctimonious rhetoric of her dangerous ecological ideology. The sheer number of spiders he found was astounding, far exceeding his initial horrific estimate. Not just a dozen or even 2 dozen, but dozens upon dozens. He counted his blood growing colder with each one he carefully secured over 50 mature female Black Widows, their distinctive abdomens swollen and glossy, their almost invisible, incredibly strong webs already being tentatively spun in dark corners under the custom-built bed frame behind the cheerfully painted curtains amongst Lily's beloved stuffed animals on the shelves. This was no accidental random migration of a few errant spiders. They had been collected, aggregated, concentrated, and then deliberately, systematically introduced into this specific room, into his daughter's most vulnerable space. The tiny gap in the window screen had been subtly, expertly widened, not torn, but carefully manipulated a perfect, almost undetectable entry point for a determined human hand. By the time his Fish and Wildlife Rapid Response Team, 2 highly trained biologists, who were also sworn peace officers, arrived alongside local police units and a county hazmat team supervisor, Mark had managed to contain the majority of the spiders, his movements precise and economical, despite the adrenaline still thrumming through his system. The bedroom was immediately declared a major crime scene, sealed off with yellow tape. Lily, thankfully, after a thorough examination by paramedics who had arrived with the first police units, had not been bitten, a small miracle Mark attributed to her profound stillness when frightened, Pip's initial protective growl perhaps having kept the spiders from venturing too far into the bed itself before he'd entered and his own swift intervention. But she was deeply, profoundly traumatized, her small body racked with uncontrollable tremors, her intelligent eyes wide and haunted with an unspoken terror that tore at Mark's soul with every ragged breath she took. Pip, the brave little calico, was also being carefully checked for bites by a sympathetic paramedic having been in the room when the arachnid invasion began. The rising action of this domestic nightmare commenced with the grim, methodical, multi-agency investigation. Lily's bedroom became a forensic playground meticulously dusted for latent prints, scoured by investigators in full protective gear for any trace evidence, fibers, hairs, foreign DNA, that might indicate how the spiders had been introduced. Patricia Dunsmore, when questioned by detectives later that night in the sterile, neutral environment of an interview room at the local police precinct, a stark, unwelcome contrast to her usually immaculate, artfully arranged living room, was a veritable pillar of feigned concern and bewildered, indignant innocence. Black Widow spiders in little Lily Thorne's bedroom. Oh, the poor precious dear. How perfectly dreadful, how absolutely terrifying for her and for her parents. She'd exclaimed, her hand flying to her chest in a gesture of theatrical shock that didn't quite reach her cold, watchful eyes. She offered a plethora of convoluted, self-serving theories. Perhaps a recent poorly executed fumigation in a neighboring property had unfortunately driven the displaced arachnids to seek shelter in the Thornes' home. Or maybe Mark, with his rather messy and unpredictable outdoor work involving all sorts of wild things, had inadvertently tragically transported egg sacs into his own home on his boots or equipment. Nature can be so terribly unpredictable at times, can't it? Detective, she'd mused, her eyes glittering with something that looked disturbingly, chillingly like profound satisfaction. Especially when a delicate natural habitat is, unduly disturbed by unnatural intrusive elements. She denied any involvement, any knowledge, any wrongdoing with an unshakable, almost reptilian, infuriating calm. But Mark, using his specialized biological and ecological knowledge, knew with absolute certainty that this was no natural occurrence, no mere accident of unfortunate proximity to the wild. The sheer concentration of mature female spiders, the specific timing, the subtle but undeniable signs of manual manipulation of the window screen. It all pointed unequivocally to a deliberate, carefully planned, human-facilitated introduction. He worked tirelessly closely with the lead police investigator assigned to the case, a sharp, methodical, no-nonsense woman named Detective Sarah Ramirez, a coincidental namesake to the protagonist of a previous unrelated horror, a common enough surname that still sent a faint shiver down his spine when he first heard it providing expert analysis on Black Widow behavior, their typical dispersal patterns, their common collection methods, and potential illicit sourcing from unscrupulous exotic pet dealers, or even from wild populations, if one knew where and how to look. The first shocking event in Patricia Dunsmore's escalating campaign of terror and intimidation came approximately a week later, while the official investigation was still painstakingly ongoing, and Dunsmore, much to Mark's fury and frustration, moved freely about the community, a self-proclaimed martyr in her own mind, subtly cultivating sympathy from some naive or fearful residents. The Thorns discovered one morning that Lily's small, accessible bird feeder, a cheerful yellow structure which hung just outside her bedroom window and brought her immense daily joy as she watched the finches and chickadees, had been brutally vandalized. The feeder itself was smashed beyond repair, the carefully selected bird seed scattered contemptuously on the ground and deliberately sadistically mixed with what looked like sharp shards of broken green glass. It was a clear, unambiguous, silently screaming message: we can still reach you. We can still touch what you love. We are still watching. No one saw who did it, of course, but the targeted malice was clearly viciously aimed at Lily's small, innocent pleasures, a petty, despicable cruelty that underscored a much larger, far more dangerous, and deeply pathological obsession. The second shocking event was more insidious, more bureaucratic, but equally chilling in its implications. Anonymous, cleverly worded complaints were filed simultaneously with both County Child Protective Services and the State Disability Rights Commission, alleging that Mark and Chloe Thorne were criminally neglecting their disabled daughter's complex medical needs and maintaining a dangerously unsafe and chronically unsanitary home environment, citing the recent, well-publicized dangerous pest infestation as irrefutable proof of their parental unfitness. The allegations were, of course, entirely baseless, demonstrably false, and easily disproven by Lily's voluminous and meticulously maintained medical records, the unwavering testimony of her many specialist doctors and therapists, and the immaculate medically adapted state of their home, which was now understandably hypervigilantly monitored by both Mark and Chloe for any new or potential threats. But the investigations themselves, however brief and ultimately unfounded, were intrusive, deeply stressful, and profoundly humiliating, a clear, calculated attempt by Dunsmore, operating through unseen cowardly proxies, to harass, discredit, and psychologically torment them to paint them as unfit, neglectful parents, and thus fatally undermine any accusations they might eventually make against her regarding the spiders. She was weaponizing the very systems designed to protect children against the parents of the child she had targeted. Mark felt a rising tide of helpless frustration and a cold, deep simmering anger that he struggled daily to control. Dunsmore was diabolically clever, meticulously careful, always operating behind a polished veneer of plausible deniability, surrounded by her small, loyal coterie of HOA devotees who seemed to believe her every pronouncement. They needed something concrete, something undeniable, something to pierce her thick armor of self-righteousness and expose the monstrous fanaticism that lurked beneath. The midpoint twist. The crucial, unexpected break in the stalled case came from Mark's own painstaking, almost obsessive, biological fieldwork around Willow Glen, combined with a lucky serendipitous break from an entirely unexpected and initially reluctant source. Mark, driven by a father's fierce, primal need to protect his child and bring her tormentor to justice, had begun to meticulously, systematically document the microfauna and arachnid populations in and around Patricia Dunsmore's own extensive property. Her yard, much larger than most in Willow Glen, was a showcase of her particular brand of native California ecological zealotry. dense, often impenetrable, overgrown thickets of indigenous chaparral plants, carefully arranged rock piles designed to attract reptiles and artfully decaying logs meant to foster insect life, all designed, she frequently and loudly proclaimed, to create a perfectly balanced, self-sustaining natural habitat, a sanctuary from human interference. He noticed during several discreet pre-dawn observation sessions from an adjacent public footpath an unusually unnaturally high concentration of black widow webs in a secluded, almost inaccessible, heavily overgrown area at the far western end of her extensive property, near a dilapidated, rarely visited, and almost completely obscured, old wooden gardener's shed. This in itself wasn't illegal or even definitively suspicious. Black widows were, after all, native to the region, and such secluded, undisturbed spots were their preferred habitat. But the sheer density of the webs, the number of mature females he could spot even from a distance with his powerful binoculars, was statistically anomalous, far exceeding what he would expect even in an ideal, natural environment. It was a biological red flag. The lucky break, the human element that began to unravel Dunsmore's carefully woven web of deceit, came from a disgruntled, recently ousted former member of Dunsmore's inner HOA clique, a nervous bird-like woman named Carol Perkins, who had recently had a very public and very bitter falling out with Dunsmore over some arcane interpretation of the HOA's composting regulations. Carol, feeling slighted, humiliated, and perhaps seeking a small measure of revenge, discreetly nervously approached Detective Ramirez. She couldn't offer direct, irrefutable proof about Dunsmore's involvement with the spiders in Lily's room. She admitted her hands trembling as she clutched a floral handkerchief. But she did recall, with a newfound clarity born of resentment, Dunsmore boasting some months ago during a private gathering of her most loyal supporters about her special, highly sensitive ecological project she was conducting in the old, forgotten gardener's shed, something about cultivating and studying a pure, resilient strain of native apex invertebrate predators for a future vaguely defined ecological rebalancing initiative within Willow Glen. Dunsmore had strictly, almost violently forbidden anyone, even her closest allies, from going anywhere near the shed, claiming the delicate nature of the subjects required absolute isolation. Carol also recounted her voice, dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, Dunsmore's increasingly extreme, almost unhinged rhetoric in private, her chilling rants about genetic purity within the ecosystem, the inherent weakening of the natural world by misguided human sentimentality and unnatural interventions, and her frequently repeated, deeply disturbing belief that nature's way is often cruel, often misunderstood by the ignorant, but it is always ultimately correct and just. Armed with this new disturbing information from Carol Perkins, which painted a chilling psychological portrait of Dunsmore and Mark's own scientific observations about the anomalous spider concentration near the old shed, Detective Ramirez finally had enough articulable suspicion to secure a comprehensive search warrant for Patricia Dunsmore's entire property, with a specific focus on the dilapidated gardener's shed and any associated computer records or personal journals. The climax. The final confrontation unfolded on a bright, deceptively cheerful Saturday morning, the kind of perfect California day that usually filled Willow Glen Heights with the sounds of lawnmowers and children's laughter. Today, however, an unnatural quiet hung over Dunsmore's meticulously kept, native plant-filled property. Mark was present in his official capacity as a state fish and wildlife senior biologist and special investigator, his presence deemed essential for the safe handling and identification of any potentially hazardous biological materials. Chloe had taken Lily and Pip to her sister's house across town, shielding her from any further trauma. Detective Ramirez led a team of uniformed police officers and forensic specialists. Dunsmore was predictably, performatively outraged by the intrusion, protesting her innocence in loud, shrill tones, threatening a barrage of lawsuits, name-dropping influential city officials she claimed were personal friends. But her eyes, usually so cold and controlled, held a new, unfamiliar flicker of something else, a raw, primal fear. The old gardener's shed, located at the very back of her sprawling, unkempt, natural lot, was locked not with a simple rusted padlock, as one might expect for such a dilapidated structure, but with a heavy-duty modern deadbolt newly installed. Inside, the air was thick, cloyingly damp, and smelled faintly of decaying leaf litter, damp earth, and something else. Something uniquely acrid and unsettling, a scent Mark recognized with a sickening lurch, as the subtle musky odor of a large arachnid colony. And there, in a series of large, carefully constructed climate-controlled terrariums, cleverly hidden beneath layers of old tarpaulins, burlap sacking, and forgotten gardening tools, was Patricia Dunsmore's special ecological project. Dozens, perhaps hundreds of black widow spiders in all stages of their life cycle, from tiny, almost invisible spiderlings to large, dangerously gravid females, their webs thick and intricate within their glass prisons. There were also several empty, recently cleaned containers, chillingly identical in size and design to the ones Mark had painstakingly used to collect and secure the spiders from Lily's violated bedroom just weeks before. On a dusty, cobweb-laden workbench lay several bound journals filled with meticulous spidery, almost indecipherable handwriting. Flipping through them, Mark saw page after page of chilling observations on black widow breeding habits, venom potency variations, and most horrifyingly detailed notes and diagrams on optimal dispersal techniques for concentrated Latrodectus populations in targeted domestic environments, with specific references to exploiting ventilation systems and window vulnerabilities. Scattered amongst the journals were printouts of extremist eco-fascist manifestos, tracts lauding natural selection through predation and advocating for the moral imperative of eliminating the genetically weak and environmentally burdensome. As Detective Ramirez, her voice devoid of emotion, but her eyes blazing with a cold fury, calmly began to read aloud excerpts from the journals, particularly a passage detailing Dunsmore's twisted pseudo-scientific rationale for employing nature's most efficient enforcers to cull the weak and unnatural elements from our besieged community, thereby restoring its inherent purity and strength. Patricia Dunsmore's carefully constructed composure finally utterly spectacularly shattered. Her face no longer a mask of offended propriety, but a terrifying rictus of pure, unadulterated fury and hate, she lunged with surprising speed towards one of the largest terrariums, a container teeming with hundreds of agitated, highly venomous spiders. "You will not interfere with nature's divine justice," she screamed, her voice cracking with a maniacal fervor, her fingers fumbling desperately with the complex latches of the terrarium, clearly intending to unleash the entire venomous swarm upon them all as a final desperate act of defiance, a suicidal, murderous diversion. Mark reacted instantly, pure instinct, overriding conscious thought. Before the startled police officers could fully respond, he tackled Dunsmore, a biologist's desperate, calculated move to prevent a catastrophic, potentially lethal release of hundreds of agitated, venomous creatures, not a trained police officer's takedown. They both went down hard onto the dusty, uneven wooden floor of the shed, the heavy terrarium teetering precariously on its stand for a heart-stopping moment before crashing to the floor beside them, the reinforced glass, miraculously holding, though. Spiders seethed and swarmed angrily within their shattered but still sealed prison, a visible, roiling testament to her madness. Uniformed officers quickly, efficiently subdued the struggling, shrieking, spitting Dunsmore, handcuffing her amidst the dusty debris of her unholy arachnid sanctuary. The falling action, following the dramatic and dangerous confrontation in the shed, was swift and decisive. Patricia Dunsmore, now utterly broken and exposed, was arrested and charged with a formidable battery of state and federal felonies, including multiple counts of attempted murder, one for each spider deliberately introduced into Lily's room. The prosecution argued aggravated assault with a deadly biological weapon, felony child endangerment, illegal cultivation, and reckless endangerment involving prohibited and dangerous venomous wildlife, and making terrorist threats based on the contents of her journals and her actions in the shed. Kevin Suter, the exotic pet store employee who had procured some initial spider specimens for Holloway in the previous but separate story, was not a factor here. Dunsmore in this narrative was a self-sufficient fanatic breeding her own arsenal. Her journals, her meticulously kept computer records detailing her dark ideology and her specific plans for Lily, and the horrifying contents of her spider-filled laboratory provided an irrefutable, chilling narrative of her premeditated, ideologically driven campaign of terror. The Willow Glen Heights community, when the carefully redacted details were eventually released, was plunged into a state of profound shock, disbelief, and collective revulsion. The HOA board, thoroughly discredited by their association with Dunsmore and horrified by the revelations of what had festered in their midst, was dissolved by an emergency vote of the traumatized but newly galvanized residents. For Mark, Chloe, and especially for little Lily, the path to healing was steep, arduous, and shadowed by the trauma they had endured. Lily required many months of intensive specialized therapy with a child psychologist experienced in dealing with extreme trauma and anxiety. Her fear of her own bedroom of spiders of the dark of any unexpected rustling sound was profound and debilitating. Pip, her loyal calico cat, became her furry, purring guardian, rarely leaving her side, his steady, loving presence a constant grounding balm to her wounded spirit. The Thorns, with the help of security experts, installed state-of-the-art fine mesh security screens on all windows, a sophisticated perimeter alarm system, and even motion-activated cameras around their property, determined to make their home an impregnable fortress of safety, a place where Lily could eventually feel secure again. But the deeper, more profound healing came from the completely unexpected, overwhelming outpouring of love, support, and practical help from their neighbors, from the wider Willow Glen community, who, shocked out of their suburban complacency by the sheer horror of Dunsmore's actions, rallied around the Thorne family with extraordinary kindness, compassion, and a shared sense of outrage. The resolution saw Willow Glen Heights undergo a profound and lasting transformation. A new interim HOA council was formed, its members carefully vetted and democratically elected, its new charter explicitly dedicated to fostering inclusivity, compassion, mutual respect, and the celebration of diversity in all its forms. Dunsmore's fanatical, punitive, native-only landscaping rules were immediately and unanimously rescinded, replaced with thoughtful science-based guidelines, encouraging biodiversity, pollinator-friendly gardens of all types, and water-wise landscaping that embraced both native and appropriate non-native plants. Lily's small sensory garden, once a target of Dunsmore's hate, became a powerful symbol of defiance and resilience. It was lovingly, carefully expanded by community volunteers, neighbors bringing plants, sharing gardening tips, transforming it into a vibrant, fragrant, accessible haven, a testament to collective healing and acceptance. Mark, drawing on his unique expertise and his family's deeply traumatic personal experience, developed with Chloe's insightful input a widely acclaimed community education program on living safely and harmoniously with urban wildlife. He emphasized respect for nature, understanding local ecosystems, and learning how to safely coexist with potentially hazardous local creatures, but he also subtly, powerfully used the platform to educate his neighbors about the critical importance of tolerance, empathy, critical thinking, and the insidious dangers of allowing extremist ideologies of any kind to fester unchallenged within a community. He didn't dwell on the specific horror they had endured, but focused on building a safer, more informed, more compassionate future for everyone in Willow Glen. Patricia Dunsmore was found guilty on all major counts by a jury that listened pale and visibly shaken to weeks of chilling testimony. Her meticulously kept journals detailing her descent into eco-fascist fanaticism and her cold-blooded plans for Lily sealed her fate. The judge, in sentencing her to the maximum possible term in a secure state psychiatric facility to be followed if she were ever deemed sane by life in prison without the possibility of parole, condemned her actions as a grotesque perversion of ecological principles, a profound betrayal of common humanity, and an act of calculated, unimaginable cruelty against a profoundly vulnerable child. More than a year after Patricia Dunsmore's arrest on a warm, breezy spring afternoon, Mark stood with Chloe at the edge of Lily's now flourishing, beautifully expanded sensory garden. Lily, though still using her colorful crutches for balance on the soft grass, was kneeling on a cushioned mat, her small, delicate hands, steadier now, gently tending a patch of fragrant, feathery chamomile. Her beloved Pip, curled asleep beside her in a welcoming patch of sun, his calico fur warm against her leg. She looked up at her parents, who were watching her with quiet pride, and a genuine, radiant, breathtakingly beautiful smile lit her face, a smile that had been absent, stolen for far too long. "Look, Daddy, Mommy," she said, her voice soft but clear and confident, pointing a small, determined finger towards a magnificent monarch butterfly that had just alighted gracefully on a bright purple coneflower near her hand. "It's so beautiful, isn't it? And it came here all on its own. It chose our garden." Mark's heart swelled with a love so fierce, so profound, it almost took his breath away. The spiders, the fear, the suffocating darkness Dunsmore had deliberately unleashed upon their lives, they would always be a part of their family's story, an indelible scar on their memories. But they would not be the end of it. They would not define Lily, nor her future. Lily, in her quiet, tenacious, extraordinary way, was reclaiming her joy, her innate curiosity, her deep spiritual connection to the true, gentle, and genuinely awe-inspiring beauty of the natural world. A world that embraced diversity, resilience, and the miracle of life in all its forms, not the sterile, hateful, twisted purity of Patricia Dunsmore's diseased and dangerous vision. The dry, terrifying whisper of venomous creatures in the dark had finally blessedly been replaced by the gentle rustle of leaves in a healing garden, the contented purr of a faithful cat, and the soft, hopeful, infinitely precious sound of his daughter's returning, unrestrained laughter.